Welcome to part one of the Muse series, a series about how to develop and maintain a healthy relationship with yourself and your art. I'm Sam, an artist who has been spending way too much time alone in their apartment, joining you today in casual quarantine wear after 2 months of self-isolation. And in this episode, we'll talk about some of our sources of validation as artists, how to identify and understand those sources of validation, and how they may be helping or hurting you. So, why do we need validation? It reinforces the narrative that we tell ourselves about who we are and how the world works. It feeds our needs for social acceptance, security in our identity, and confirmation that we are safe, especially in a profession where rejection is abundant and often necessary to eventually advance our careers. It also allows us, not always accurately, to judge our value. I won't tell you not to seek validation, because I know that a lot of what we hear about external validation is that you shouldn't need it, but we all need it to some extent, or we all rely on it to some extent. So instead of rejecting validation totally, you may find it helpful to examine the sources of validation and understand the value of that source. So we're going to talk about some of the potential sources of validation as an artist. Awards and annuals, progress, money, peers and community, clients, and social media. Validation can come from a lot of places, but we're going to talk about these for now. These are all external sources of validation, which means to some extent they're out of your control. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as you're understanding what your relationship is with that source and trying to figure out when it's time to take a step back, make boundaries, or reevaluate your relationship with it. So let's get into it. The meat of this video is probably going to be a lot longer than some of the later videos, but if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can take a break. The transcript is also available over on my Patreon, as well as a bunch of notes. So you can take a break, you can go read the transcript, you can look at the worksheet and get the questions that go along with it. Whatever you need, approach it however you want. I hope this is useful to you. Enjoy. The arts are one of those weird careers where there are a lot of contests and annuals to enter your work into. When I was first getting into illustration, they held a lot of value for me, and I felt a lot of pressure from my peers to enter my work into certain annuals, which were viewed as particularly prestigious or popular. I was lucky and got an early piece of my work into a competitive annual, which was certainly an ego boost, but didn't boost my career in any measurable way. Years later, as I'm finding my voice, I'm also finding that my work is constantly rejected from those same annuals. I believe, and I think most of my peers would agree, that my new work is better. But if so, why isn't it getting into those annuals when some of my old work got in? Have my skills and vision shriveled up and disappeared? Am I delusional and all my work is actually horrible? Some people might think so. Should I just quit art? You may relate to this story, and you've probably experienced rejection for yourself. There are many reasons for those rejections, and none of them is that your art is objectively bad. For one, there are a ton of people submitting their work to these annuals. The competition is intense. No matter how amazing you are, there will always be someone who prefers someone else's work over yours. And that's okay, you don't need to please everyone. Not only is the competition fierce, but the work that is accepted is a result of judges that often shift from year to year and have their own taste in art. You may find that as you develop your own voice, it's possible that your work has developed away from the aesthetics that these annuals aim to represent. I know many amazing artists that get rejected year after year, and many more amazing artists who don't even submit their work. And it may just be a matter of their style being a bit of an outlier, and I don't see that as a bad thing at all. So here are some questions to ask yourself how valuable getting accepted into art annuals and winning awards may be for you. If you are accepted or win an award, how does that validate you? Does the recognition motivate you? Does it validate your skills and your work? How will receiving an award aid you in your path as an artist? How do you believe it will affect you in the long run? Are those benefits worth the submission fees for the annual? Are there other sources of validation that can provide the same or similar benefits? And what if you don't get an award? What if you don't get into the art annual at all? What if you submit a bunch of work to an annual and the only piece that gets in is a piece that you feel is least representative of your work and the direction you want to go with it? Do you deny what you're excited about with your work in order to pursue the direction that has been approved by your peers? Or do you ignore it and continue in the direction that you believe in? The answers to these questions depend on what your career goals are. Some artists will find more value in awards and annuals than others. I also want to be clear that annuals are not a judge of work that is objectively good, but are a reflection of the current aesthetic or a taste of a certain bubble within an art community. This is why some years you may get into an annual and others you may not. It's why you get into an annual focused on watercolor paintings, but not into an annual focused on science fiction illustrations. It's why the art that is accepted into the annual may shift in style over the years. Does it feel especially good to complete a project? Yes. Do your accomplishments drive you? Yes. Are you a workaholic? Yes! Hi, this is totally my main source of validation. I constantly have to-do lists, and if I don't hit my goals or if I feel like I'm not accomplishing everything and being perfect, my whole brain just has a meltdown and I go from being me to a miserable, verbally self-harming, frustrated monster that wants to tear itself apart. And that, my friends, is not healthy. I've learned to deal with my brain through knowing how to pause and get a realistic perspective on situations and by creating boundaries. But we'll get into that in a later episode. I know so many artists who are ruled by their accomplishments to the point that their physical and mental health gets neglected. I also find that this behavior is often rewarded socially or a point of pride for people. Have you ever mentioned that you stayed up till 3 a.m. all week working on a project with the intention of impressing people? Have you ever said that sleep is for the weak, or told folks that they need to work themselves half to death to be successful? Shh, please stop. Our culture is so steeped in this idea that we are only as valuable as what we can produce. This mindset creates an environment where the average person is overworked, underpaid, taken advantage of by higher-ups, and being treated as laborers and not humans, and we really don't need that in the art industry. It's a mindset that really frustrates me. We need to treat ourselves and each other as humans. We also need to make sure that people have the ability to take breaks and care for themselves, and that the ability to do those things is not a mark of privilege. I also just want to say that if you're overworking yourself because you are not getting paid enough, I totally understand. And I know that that's a really hard situation to be in. And I would love to just fix everything in place that is keeping you from being paid what you're worth. So, anyway. Being productive does provide me with validation, but I've learned ways to check in with myself so that I can sustainably keep creating and prevent hitting a point of burnout. So ask yourself, do you base your personal value on output? Do you feel guilty when you do something that isn't work, like hanging out with friends or relaxing? Do you create unrealistic goals and then beat yourself up when you fail to reach them? Are you working in a sustainable way, doing your best to mentally and physically support yourself so you don't hurt yourself in the long term? Do you overwork yourself to the point of burnout? Do you take breaks and stretch? Do you feel pressured to constantly post new work on social media for fear that you'll be forgotten or fall behind? Have you created boundaries between work and non-work? Have you been so preoccupied with checking off the next thing on your to-do list that you haven't checked in to make sure that those short-term goals align with your long-term goals? Early on in my career, I idolized folks who were full-time artists working in the studio all day, enjoying that sweet financial stability and living what seemed to be a distant, glamorous artist life. Well, I was living with my parents, working a horrible job, and throwing all my money into paying back my student loans. For me, financial stability is a huge contributor to my mental health. I still go through bouts of financial uncertainty, and it's often one of the more difficult things to deal with as an independent artist. For me personally, I've found that validation with money has a lot to do with the idea that if you're not contributing financially, you are a burden. Those seem to be the only two identities we give ourselves when it comes to finances. Contributing to family finances and having financial security feels really good, and struggling with finances often makes us feel like a failure, especially in a culture where we value a person for how much money they're worth. In order to better understand how money is affecting your self-worth, here are some questions you can ask yourself. Does your ability to support yourself or contribute to your family validate your art career? Do you feel like you're only a real artist if you're making your income solely from art? How much do you compare your lifestyle to the lifestyle of other artists you see on social media? What assumptions do you make about their financial situation based on what you see on their social media? What artists do you know have been open about their financial successes and struggles? After asking these questions, can you re-examine how your view on money and art is affecting how valid you feel as an artist? I lived with my parents after college for years and kept a non-art job for most of that time. I didn't move out until about 6 months ago. It's okay to have a full-time job, a part-time job, or even pick up a different job after being a full-time artist for a while. It doesn't discount your identity as an artist or the value of your work. If you're part of my generation and went to college, you're probably stuck with a ton of student loan debt, and finances as a freelancer can be really unpredictable, which puts you in a weird spot. There's nothing wrong with asking for help, and there's no reason to beat yourself up if you're struggling. It's not easy. This is a topic I'm still exploring and learning about, and I find that people can be very sensitive or have very strong feelings about money. So if you have opinions or thoughts, please leave a comment. Community can be a huge source of inspiration and support, or it can be a source of unhealthy competition and unhealthy mindsets. I've been a part of different peer groups and communities, and over time I've learned what environments help me grow and where my contributions are most valuable. There are a few things that are important to consider while evaluating your relationship to community and peers. Are you dependent on your community for validation and decision making? What are you contributing to the community? Are you balancing these two aspects of the relationship? It's good to be a part of a community, but it's also important to find the best community for you. Does the community you're a part of reflect the same values that you personally value? Does your community support you, but also push you out of your comfort zone into a place of growth? Do you thrive better in a group of a few peers or in a large community, in person or online? And the final consideration here is how you react to feedback within the community. How does it feel to have someone you admire compliment your work? How do you respond when they critique it? What happens when you feel like you're not getting the feedback you expected from your peers? Do you grow from it, or do you shut down? If you find yourself having a lot of negative reactions to feedback, it may be helpful to step back from the community for a bit and explore why you're having those reactions to feedback. Do you have a big name dream client that you'd love to work with? Many artists do, but we don't always examine why we've chosen that client as our big goal. You might want to work with certain clients because of the prestige it comes with or because many of your peers have worked with them. But you need to ask if working with that client actually aligns with your goals and interests. For example, I hear a lot of budding artists in my community saying that their dream client is Magic the Gathering. But when asked to look closer, they may find that an assignment with Magic the Gathering doesn't actually fit well with the work they love doing. When you find that the client doesn't match your work, you get stuck with the question, do I want to push my work in a direction that suits the client, or are there other goals I have that require me to push my work in a totally different direction? When you hit this point, it's up to you to decide what your priorities are based on your personal goals. Regardless of what you decide is right for you, I don't think it's fair to judge your worth based on who you've worked with. Though I also understand the value of being able to say you've worked with certain clients. Having spoken with several art directors, they may have an artist they want to work with, but can't hire them because the right project to match with that artist may not have come along yet and may not come along for years. An art director may also see potential in your work that you do not, and may be better able to match your work to an assignment than you are. There are a lot of factors that go into figuring out where your work fits into the world. Here are some questions to ask yourself if a main source of validation is the clients you've worked for or want to work for. Do you have a dream client, and do the goals you have for your own work align with the work they're looking for? Why is working with that specific client valuable to you? Do you want to push your work in a direction that suits a certain client, or do you have other goals that you want to prioritize? Do you want to maintain separate portfolios for different types of clients? Do you feel like you haven't made it until you've worked with a certain client? Are you open to pushing your work into directions that an art director suggests? Social media is a tricky relationship to navigate, but I know it can contribute a lot to our sense of validity. It functions with its own reward system, often determined by a constantly changing algorithm and designed to get people addicted to checking it. So when exploring social media as a source of validation, it's very important to be aware of what boundaries you have in place regarding your social media usage. I used to have a very different relationship with social media. I'd compare my numbers to the numbers of others and get frustrated trying to understand why my work wasn't getting the recognition others were getting. It would bring me into a really nasty headspace of comparison and unhealthy competition. When I recognized this habit of mine, I shifted my focus away from numbers and instead put my effort into building community and conversations, which for me were more valuable and validating than my numbers. I've also put boundaries in place regarding my time spent on social media and have practiced being aware of the headspace I'm in while using social media, because I can easily slip into that place of unhealthy comparison if I'm not careful. Again, we'll get more into boundaries in a later episode. So here are your questions. Does your sense of validation as an artist directly correlate to your likes and follows? What does social media contribute to your goals? Is it doing more than just giving you a feel-good dopamine hit? Are you feeding into the algorithm, or are you finding a way to make the algorithm work for you? Are you focused on community building, conversations, numbers? Can you use your numbers as information that aids in building your audience instead of making the numbers themselves the end goal? Do you compare yourself to others and their numbers? Do you spend more time checking social media than you do creating work? What boundaries do you have in place regarding social media usage? So now that you've been thinking about this for a bit, here's an exercise for you. First, identify what your career goals are so that you have some framework. What do you want to be doing with your art in a year? In 5 years? What sort of habits are you hoping to have? What do you want your relationship with your work to be like? Now, identify your main sources of validation. If there's more than one, begin with the one which is most relevant at the moment. make a list of the ways in which that source of validation is helpful for you and helps you reach your goals. Then, list ways in which that source of validation has been unhealthy or detrimental to you and your relationship with your work. Use this list of pros and cons to help determine if your main source of validation is unhealthy, and think of some alternate sources of where you can find validation or ways to shift your perspective on that source so that it is working for you in a more positive way. And also, check in with what your boundaries are regarding that source of validation. Are there any boundaries that you need to create that will help you get into a healthier mindset? So I hope that was useful to you and interesting and maybe got you thinking. Worksheets and episode transcripts are available for free over on my Patreon. It's important to me to make this video series free, so if you're really enjoying it or getting a lot out of the worksheets, please share it with a friend, or you can go over to my Patreon, and for $1 or more a month you can join and you get access to a ton of posts. I post about twice a week, and these are all things that go behind the scenes on my art, about my inspirations and process. There's also a Discord chat through my Patreon where there's a dedicated channel for discussing the topics in these videos with other artists like you. Up next, we'll be talking about how to value yourself without these external sources of validation. So I'll see you in a few weeks.